welcome to The Fyrdsman. I'm your host Connor, and today we're going to be looking at a relatively niche theory, one that will require us to look at archaeological, literary and linguistic evidence from across Europe in order to shed some light on it. Well, today we are going to be taking a look at the evidence for the existence of an Odinnic wolf cult, something which people have long hypothesized about, but unfortunately it is relatively difficult to prove one way or the other. Now, our working hypothesis is that in Indo-Germanic culture, young men were separated from their tribe at a relatively young age and sent forth on missions of raid and conquest. Now, during this time apart from their tribe and their mothers and the warmth of their village, they would be taught the art of being a warrior and the sacred lore of the ancestors, which to these cultures was mostly one and the same thing. So here we are talking about wolf cults and Odin worship. What exactly is it that we mean? Well, to start off with, let's have a look at some of the archaeological evidence. Up here we have a picture of the Torslanda plate, which is a Scandinavian find dated to either the 6th or 7th centuries. Now, upon this plate there are two figures depicted. The first of which many people believe to be Woden. You've got the horned helmet, you've got the spear, you've got the sword, leading a warrior in some form of cultic dance. Now, with this plate, it is the second figure that I would like to particularly draw your attention to. Obviously, as you can see here, he's got some form of animal headdress on, probably a wolf that reaches down to just below his waist. He's drawing a sword and he also has a spear. Very obviously, these two figures are martial, and it may be that this second figure represents one of a greater whole. That is to say, he is part of a band of warriors, much like him, which a lot of people tend to call the Ulfhednar or the Ulfheðnar. Now, the Ulfhednar or the Ulfheðnar are renowned as Woden's wolf warriors, much like the berserkers and the bear shirts. Now, I'm sure you will have heard of the berserkers, the bare-shirted warriors of Odin who fear neither steel nor flame, who bite the edges of their shield in wrath and mow down whatever enemy stands in their way. Understandably, the berserkers are relatively popular. They appear in quite a few different sagas and they've become somewhat of a mythological symbol of the Vikings. However, there are lots of videos of berserkers out there. Hell, we might even do one ourselves one day. So today we are going to stay focused upon the Ulfhednar, who are altogether more mysterious and whose origins we need to look a little bit deeper for. Now, in her doctoral thesis, Chris Kershaw proposes the idea of what she terms the Indo-Germanic Mannebunde. Now, the idea behind this is that the Ulfhednar and the wolf cult of Odin is not a unique occurrence. She believes that it is a tradition that goes back to the very roots of Indo-European society, and indeed she draws parallels with lots of different wolf cults from across the continent. Indeed, if we take a look at some of the other archaeological evidence from across Europe, we can see the same spear-dancing men depicted at Sutton Hoo and Brickheim. And looking at the Gutenberg sword scabbard, we again see animal-headed warriors wielding spear and sword, flanked by Woden. So, to dig deeper into the mythological origins of the Odinnic wolf cult, what we're going to have to do is to go a little bit further back in time. No, I don't mean to the Anglo-Saxons, I don't mean to the Romans, I mean way back to the Indo-Europeans. So to start with, let's take a look at some of the literature. In the poetic corpus of Iceland, Odin is known by many different names, one of which I would like us to focus on for the remainder of this video. Now, that name is Herja. Now, Hergian is normally translated as something akin to ruler or leader or chief, which for the most part is an okay translation, but it doesn't get quite to the core of what Odin was to these wolf cults. Now, the word Hergian can be traced back to the Old Germanic Harjanas and the Proto-Indo-European Korionos, both of which mean kind of the leader of something. Now, the Indo-European suffix nos means chief of. Its prefix would be describing what they are the boss of. Alright? Now, whilst this generally can be an okay translation, sometimes it is not particularly appropriate. In the same way that we can look at the Gothic word Theodans and trace that back to the Old Germanic word Teutonos, which means chief of the Teutons, we can look at the Old English word Drayton and trace that back to, again, the Germanic word Drugstinos, which means chief of the household or leader of the people. This cannot be applicable in all situations though. If we take the word Neptunus to mean chief of the water, that doesn't quite sit right. The god Neptune is the personification of the seas, of the ocean, of all things wet and damp. he is not merely the Lord of the Water. The same applies to Odin as Herja. He is not merely the chief of the Her, he is the personification of it. Now, if we are to view Odin as not just the leader of the warband but the personification of it, then we should look at the Her for which he is most well renowned. I am of course talking about the Herja, those warriors who died in battle, who were carried up to Valhalla by the Valkyries, and who will take their place fighting beside Odin at the final battle of Ragnarok. Now, in stanza 23 of Grimnismal, we see the line, 500 doors and 40 more I count at Valhall, 800 Herja will walk through them apiece when it comes the time to fight the wolf. Now, although parts of the Grimnismal saga are undoubtedly quite old, there are a few additions by Snorri which are, relatively speaking, modern. These mostly account for a list of names or a list of events that he's kind of wedged in there as a place to keep it. However, one of the oldest parts of Grimnismal is this clear idea of the Herja and the warriors as defenders against the forces of chaos and indeed the wolf. This wolf, of course, being Fenrir, who is prophesied to eventually eat Odin at Ragnarok. Now, Kershaw argues that the Herja are the mystical paradigm of the Mannebunde. They are its highest possible incarnation, its paragon, if you will. The idea of men and warriors as protection against the forces of chaos is an old idea. And indeed, by the time that Snorri starts writing about the Herja, the mythical bands that they represent, the Berserkers and the Ulfhednar, are already being outlawed. So it may be that the Herja are a learned and literary development of a tradition that goes back much, much further. Now, obviously, the word Her is a noun. It signifies the existence of the warband. But what we need to look at is what we mean by the term warband. So for that, we must look at the relevant verbs in Old English and in Old Norse. Now, in the Old English language, the verb that we are looking at is Hergian, and in Old Norse, it is Herja. Now, both of these verbs mean to make predatory raids, to ravage, to despoil, to plunder, etc., etc. Which brings us on to the idea of what exactly was warfare for the Indo-Europeans, and what was it for the Germanic peoples who are descended from them? Well, if we look back to early European times, we see that warfare, for the most part, consists of razzias, which are essentially small raids where you go out and get plunder. Indeed, in the Iliad, it is often the scenes where Achilles is describing his raids upon Troy, stealing wealth, stealing resources, stealing cattle, stealing women, that are the most believable. It is not unfair to say that ancient Greece was an age of piracy, but rather than bringing dishonour upon the perpetrators, piracy was a source of reputation, of wealth, and of honour for the people who committed it. Indeed, it would often be the case that one would boast of how many riches they had seized, how much cattle they had managed to take from their enemies. Indeed, by the time we get to late antiquity, we still see Tacitus referencing the Germanic tribes as having their main source of wealth as cattle, mostly stolen from other tribes on various different raids. Now, if we look at some of the Germanic law codes, we can get a clearer idea of what the Her actually is. The old sources say that the Gothic Army numbered about 3,000 men when fully assembled. If we look at the Anglo-Saxon law code, we can see that a Her is comprised of 35 men. Same with the Bavarian law code at 43 men, the Danish at 5, and the Langobards at 4 men. It is clear then that these Hers are not the fully fledged tribal armies that Tacitus refers to, but instead they are raiding parties. So the idea is that these small raiding parties would have consisted mostly of adolescent boys, those who have not yet reached full manhood. They would function as small, highly mobile guerrilla units who would be learning on the job, learning self-control, mastery, stealth, how to use their weapons effectively. These young men would gain honour and prestige from their raids and from the wealth they brought back to the tribe. Now, obviously, the bonds between brothers in arms are strong, but in this society it is not just a martial bond that brings these adolescents together. It is a cultic bond, a religious dedication to the god Wodan, Odin, Woden, whatever terminology you want to use. Now at this point you may be thinking, I don't care. Shut up about warbands, shut up about the Herja, stop talking about etymology, get on to the good stuff. And trust me, I'm getting there. But we need to take another look at something a little bit obscure first. Now, in order to properly assess the wolf cult, we need to look at something called the wild hunt. Now, I know what you're thinking, the hunt is later medieval, surely we as early medievalists do not need to bother with it. And for the most part, you are right. Woden evidently attracted a lot of folkloric elements which originally had nothing to do with him. However, there are elements which probably belong to the original cult of Odin, as well as other elements which seem to have no religious significance at all until we can connect them to the wider Indo-European world where we see them crop up again. So we suspect that there is something incredibly old and incredibly significant about the wild hunt, even if that significance at the minute eludes us. So what we want to do is pick out the elements of the hunt which originally belonged to Woden and discard those which have been gained from elsewhere. Now, the wild hunt is essentially a spectral host led by Odin through towns and through villages. In this host appear all sorts of ghostly apparitions. You see armed men, dogs, wolves, horses, demons, etc, etc, etc. Now, whilst each of these regions have its own particular flavour, so for instance the hunt will be different in northern Germany than it was in southern Germany, than it was in France, Switzerland, England, etc, etc. The main thing to bear in mind is that although this horrifying procession of demons and ghouls is, well, horrifying, it was looked upon by glee with the villagers. The people awaited it with eager anticipation because it brought fertility to both field and flock. Now, these spectral hosts and the masked men who took part in the physical processions of the wild hunt can be explained as remnants of the actual cultic practices of the Woden religion. Now, these wolf-masked men were the living counterparts to the mythical paradigm of the Herja. As far as themselves and the villagers were concerned, the wolf-masked men were in cultic union, a living flesh and blood reincarnation of their ancestors. Now, this isn't just me drawing random hypotheticals. Notable folklorists of the 20th century were already coming to the same conclusions, connecting the pagan cult of the dead with the mass processions of Christmastide and the carnival. Now, it was the folklorist Ludwig von Schroeder which linked the idea of the spectral army from the European variant of the wild hunt to the wider Indo-European tradition. He drew a comparison between the ecstatic warrior Mannebunde of Europe with the Thyasos of the Indian god Rudra. He argued that the flesh and blood, spear and sword dancers of the German lands were intrinsically connected with the Sali of the Mars cult and the Maruts of India. And even before Schroeder, other folklorists had already connected the idea of the masked martial procession with other gods, such as the wild hunt of Artemis or Dionysus. And so it is, when we take a look at the wider picture, we begin to see remnants of this Mannebunde across all of the Indo-European daughter nations. Within these warrior societies, each nation retains a small fragment of the original puzzle. However, having the individual pieces of a puzzle is not very useful unless we have the framework with which to put them in. And so it was that at the beginning of the 20th century, folklorists and historians of religion began to conduct further research into ancestor cults, rites of passage, and ecstatic experiences. Now, they discovered that across Indo-European warrior societies there was a common belief that there is something within man of a higher or divine origin. To these Indo-European warrior societies, death was not the end. They believed that your life force lived on within your body, despite all evidence to the contrary. There are three features which govern the primitive society's conception towards the dead. The first is that they still live, even after they have passed from the mortal realm. The second is that they are powerful, more so than when they were alive. And the third is that they are simultaneously well-dispositioned and also malicious towards the living. Now, we particularly want to pay attention to the third point, the fact that the dead are either malicious or well-meaning towards the living. This means that the dead can either be a helpful defender or a dangerous enemy. Now, within Indo-European societies, it was the former attitude that retained precedence. They believed that the dead were helpful and they actively wanted to help the living. They believed that the dead warrior was immortal, that their soul would continue to help the tribe, and that they would also help the gods in the final battle against the forces of evil and disintegration. It's worth bearing in mind that the concept of Ragnarok, where all of the gods ultimately die, was a relatively new concept by the time that Snorri was writing it down. It was quite late. However, the concept of the Herja, the men who defend against the forces of the wolf, was an old idea. Now, if we look at warrior societies, generally the men are broken up into 3 or 4 different age classes. There might be a class of elder men who were past their fighting years, but whose wisdom and experience was still of great use to the tribe. There were the class of mature married men. They would have wives and children, they would carry on the business of the tribe, and during times of war they would form the main, disciplined and experienced fighting force. Now, at the very bottom of the system are the little boys, the children who have not yet reached puberty, and who for the most part belong with the women and children. They are not part of the warrior system as of yet. Now, at some point before puberty, these little boys will be taken from the world of women to be trained in the art of being a warrior and inducted into the law and traditions of the tribe. It is here that they will be initiated into the world of men. To start with, they will be the scouts, the guerrilla fighters, the highly ecstatic warriors who fling themselves first into the fray. In our study of Germania and the Indo-European world, it is this group of boys that will concern us. The Mannebunde, the Korionos, the Herja. Now, the age at which the boys first underwent this rite of passage varies from group to group. In Sparta, we know it was at the age of 7, and there is evidence that in India it was still a relatively early age. Now, the severity and hardship which these boys faced varied significantly from society to society. But even in a highly successful and well-structured warrior society like the Maasai of 100 years ago, the training was long, hard, and rigorous. There is no reason for us to believe that it was any different for the Indo-Europeans. Now, typically for a good part of the period, the boy would live in the forest, become like the beasts of the forest. He became a hardy and crafty hunter and fighter. But that was only part of becoming a man of his people. As a family man and a citizen, he would have to know the correct prayers and cultic practices as well as the history of his tribe. Now, it is not possible here to go into every different permutation of the system. It is important for us that this passage was from the world of women and other non-initiates into the set of the men of the tribe, all the men whom had ever lived. This initiation involved a real death. The child died, and a man of the tribe was reborn. Now, if initiation is the process of death and rebirth, of course this constitutes a ritual death. But for these people, the sacred was very much real. So this ritual death was, for all intents and purposes, a real death. Once the boy is initiated, he belongs to the dead ancestors. Now, these ancestors are immortal. The real death is meaningless. The initiate is more real than the non-initiate. Now, one of the most important functions of these initiates was to not just represent the dead, but to become the dead. It is the nature of the dead that they are not seen. We bury them and they lie under the earth. Now, the way in which these initiates become the dead is through the use of masks. Now, when we say mask, we're not just talking about something that covers a face. Obviously, the most primitive form of masking is the painting of the face and the painting of the body. Now, we do have in Scandinavia representations of these cultic dancers wearing actual physical masks that do look like wolf's head, as we mentioned in the Torslander plate earlier, which I'm now bringing up on the screen again. You have the representation of the dancer as wearing the wolf headdress that comes down to the knees. Now, the animals that were found in the wild hunt are often the wolf, the dog, and the bear. Now, these of course are the animals which the Ulfhednar and the berserkers are supposed to have become when the trance came over them. Now, particularly in Indo-European societies, the wolf and the dog, as well as the horse, were associated closely with death. Now, it must be recognised that the idea of these masks is not to make the wearer look like an animal, it is to signify that they are something more than a human. They are demonic, they are the ancestors. Now, it matters not whether the actual mask is the wolf head, like the Ulfhednar, or the bear head, like the berserkers, or whether the cultic dancer has simply blackened his skin with ash or whitened it with gypsum. It is the idea of masking over your body in order to create a connection to the ancestors, to present yourself as more than human. Now, I am aware that this video has already gone on for much longer than I expected it to, so I'm going to start to wrap things up here. If you would like to see another video of me covering the various different incarnations of the Indo-Germanic Mannebunde and the wolf cults, please leave a comment down below. As I said, we have only really started to scratch the surface of the Indo-European wolf cult. To summarise, these wolf warriors were taken from their tribe as adolescents and put through rites of passage far from society. During their time out in the woods, they would be expected to learn the skills of being a warrior, as well as the traditions, rituals and customs of their tribe. It is during this time away from society that they would become dedicated to Odin, the god associated with vagabonds, criminals, vagrants, the wandering man, as well as royalty and the lords. The wolf cult of Odin was much more than a mere military order. It was a fanatical religious cult. These ecstatic warriors, clad in wolfskin, were doing so in order to form a connection between themselves and their deceased ancestors. The wearing of the wolfskin was the donning of a mask intended to to embody the power of the dead. As the god of the dead who takes his chosen warriors to Valhalla, these wolf cults would embody the spirits of the dead in order to fight and terrify their enemies. Now, through the use of these masks, these warriors would have been a terrifying sight for their enemies. And not just foreign enemies such as the Romans, who encountered the Hari and the Chatti tribes as recorded by Tacitus, but also their fellow Germanic tribes. If you thought that you were fighting against an incarnation of the ancestors, fueled by rage and the power of the dead, it would be a terrifying experience. Remember, the dead are immortal. They have already died. They cannot die again. Just wanted to say a big thank you to those of you who've stuck out and watched this video till the very end. This is the first video on the Thefyrdsman channel and ultimately the start of many, many more. If you would like to see another video on the Indo-Germanic Mannebunde and the wolf cults, please do leave a comment in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please do feel free to subscribe and leave a little like for us. It really does help and we do appreciate everything you do. Thank you once again for watching. For now, goodbye.